It was Christmas Eve, and the snow fell in soft, silent sheets. Sarah wrapped herself in a warm blanket and sipped her cocoa, enjoying the quiet evening. It was the first Christmas she would spend alone since her parents had passed away the previous year. A mix of grief and loneliness kept her from traveling to see friends, but she told herself she didn't mind. She had peace, warmth, and a tree glowing brightly in the corner. Then she heard it, singing. At first, it was faint, like a melody carried by the wind. Silent night, holy night, Sarah smiled. Carolers were a rare sight these days. The old-fashioned cheer was comforting in its way. The singing grew louder, clear and persistent. Sarah frowned. The voices seemed off, slow and hollow, as though they came from a great distance. She peeked out the window. 3 figures stood beneath her porch light. They were cloaked in black, their faces hidden in the hoods. They didn't hold songbooks or candles, just stood still as the unnerving song echoed into the night. Sarah hesitated but decided to open the door. "Hello?" she called. The figures stopped singing. For a moment, the silence was deafening. "Can I help you?" The figures didn't move. Unnerved, Sarah slammed the door shut, bolting it. Her heart raced as she leaned against it, listening. There were no footsteps, no sign the figures had left. Suddenly, the singing began again, louder this time, almost vibrating through the walls. Sarah pulled her phone out and dialed a neighbor, Mrs. Bennet. When the old woman answered, her voice crackled with static. "Mrs. Bennet, there are carolers outside, N." "Sarah?" Mrs. Bennet interrupted. "Get away from the window." "What? Why?" Sarah whispered. "They've come back. Don't look at them. Don't let them see you." "What do you mean, come back?" Sarah whispered. Click. The call disconnected. Panic set in. Sarah drew the curtains and paced the room, the haunting voices pressing against her ears. "Sleep in heavenly peace." And then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number read. "We're here to sing for you. Let us in." Sarah dropped the phone. Slowly, the singing moved inside the house. The voices sounded impossibly close, as if they were coming from every direction. She turned toward the fireplace. The 3 figures were there, standing silently, their hoods casting deep shadows over their hollow faces. Their mouths moved in unison, but no sound came out. "No!" Sarah screamed. She backed away, tripping over the rug. The figures stepped forward in perfect harmony, their song building to an unbearable pitch. The last thing Sarah saw was their pale hands reaching for her, their mouths splitting into grotesque smiles as the world turned black. The next morning, Mrs. Bennet called the police after seeing Sarah's door ajar. Officers found no sign of her. The only trace of Sarah was a faint, ghostly hum that filled the empty house. "Sleep in heavenly peace." The Johnson family had little to spare for Christmas that year. It had been a difficult 12 months, bills piled up, Mr. Johnson's job hours were cut, and Mrs. Johnson had only recently started part-time work to make ends meet. Their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was wise beyond her years and didn't complain when her parents explained that Santa couldn't bring many presents this year. "That's okay," she said with a bright smile. "Christmas isn't about stuff." On Christmas morning, however, something unexpected happened. Lily sat cross-legged under the small, sparsely decorated tree, opening a few small gifts, a scarf, a handmade bracelet, and a coloring book. Then, just as they thought the morning was over, Lily's eyes widened. "Look," she gasped, pointing. A small box, neatly wrapped in red paper with a gold ribbon, sat at the foot of the tree. Neither Mr. nor Mrs. Johnson remembered putting it there. "Did you?" Mr. Johnson started. His wife shook her head, a look of confusion spreading across her face. "No. Maybe your mother sent something." "Open it," Lily said excitedly. The couple exchanged nervous glances as Lily eagerly tore into the wrapping paper. Inside was a porcelain doll. It was delicate, with black curls cascading over its shoulders, painted rosy cheeks, and glassy green eyes that seemed too lifelike. The doll wore an elegant white dress, trimmed with lace, and held a small red ribbon in one hand. "She's beautiful," Lily squealed, hugging it tightly. "Her name is Clara." "Clara?" Mrs. Johnson repeated, unsettled. "How do you know her name?" Lily looked up with innocent eyes. "She told me." Mr. Johnson frowned. "Did you buy that?" he asked his wife quietly. "No. I've never seen it before. Maybe someone dropped it off anonymously." Mr. Johnson reasoned, though his voice lacked conviction. Something about the doll unsettled him. Its lifelike eyes seemed to follow him wherever he moved. Lily, however, was smitten. She carried Clara with her all day, brushing her curls and whispering to her like she was a real friend. "Clara says she likes it here," Lily told her mother later that evening as she climbed into bed. Mrs. Johnson paused. "What do you mean, honey?" "She talks to me," Lily replied matter-of-factly, tucking the doll under the covers beside her. "She says I'm her best friend now." That night, the house grew silent as the family slept, until Mr. Johnson woke to the sound of giggling. He rubbed his eyes, groaning. "Lily," he muttered, half asleep. The giggling grew louder, clearer, and distinctly childlike. Concerned, he got up and made his way to Lily's room. The door was ajar. Inside, he found the doll seated upright on the floor, facing Lily's bed. Lily was sound asleep. Mr. Johnson frowned and picked up the doll, unsettled by its expression. Its glassy eyes seemed to mock him. He placed it back in the toy chest and shut the lid firmly. The next morning, Lily woke up with dark bruises on her arms. "What happened, sweetheart?" Mrs. Johnson gasped, gently touching her daughter's arm. Lily shrugged. "Clara held me too tight." Mrs. Johnson looked at her husband with growing dread. "That's it," Mr. Johnson growled. He stormed into Lily's room, grabbed the doll, and marched outside into the cold. Opening the trash bin, he tossed Clara in, slamming the lid shut. "No more Clara," he muttered as he walked back inside. That night, everything seemed fine, until the giggling returned. It started faintly, echoing through the halls. Mrs. Johnson sat up, her blood running cold. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mr. Johnson groaned. "It's probably Lily." Before he could finish, both froze. Slowly, they turned toward the foot of the bed. Clara sat there, her glassy green eyes locked on them. Mrs. Johnson let out a choked scream. "How did she?" From Lily's room came a faint, disembodied whisper, "She's back." Terrified, the Johnsons rushed to Lily's room. The door creaked open slowly, and there, in the pale moonlight, sat Lily, cross-legged on the floor. She held Clara tightly, her face blank. "She doesn't want to leave," Lily said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Lily, give me the doll," Mr. Johnson shouted, stepping forward. Lily didn't move. The room seemed to grow colder. Suddenly, Clara's head snapped toward Mr. Johnson, and its porcelain grin stretched unnaturally wide. The lights flickered, and a gust of icy wind blew through the room. "Get rid of it!" Mrs. Johnson screamed, grabbing her daughter. The doll's glassy eyes seemed to glow as it giggled, the sound echoing unnaturally. Mr. Johnson lunged at it, but the moment he touched it, a violent chill shot through his body, and he collapsed to the floor. The lights went out completely. The next morning, neighbors found the Johnsons' house eerily silent. The front door stood ajar, and snow had blown inside. The family was gone. In Lily's room, seated neatly in the center of the bed, was Clara. Her glassy green eyes seemed to glisten with amusement. From the corner of the room, faint and ghostly, came the sound of a little girl's voice, whispering, "Clara says we're staying forever." The visitor on Christmas night. Mark lived alone in a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town. The place wasn't much to look at: peeling wallpaper, a creaky floor, and drafty windows that did little to keep out the chill, but Mark had grown used to it. It was his home, and for now, that was enough. Christmas night had arrived, but for Mark, it felt like any other evening. He sat slumped on his worn-out couch, a half-empty beer bottle in one hand, scrolling through his phone with the other. Social media was flooded with pictures of happy families, bright lights, and joyful gatherings. Mark's friends had invited him to a few parties, but he declined. The holiday cheer wasn't for him this year. As the old clock above the kitchen door ticked toward midnight, the apartment settled into its usual silence. Mark exhaled deeply, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. Just as he closed his eyes, there came a faint knock at the door. He sat up, frowning. Who would come by so late on Christmas night? Knock, knock. A chill prickled the back of Mark's neck. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the small apartment. There was no answer. After a long pause, curiosity got the better of him. Mark walked to the door, unbolted it, and cracked it open just a sliver. The hallway outside was dimly lit, and empty. He stepped out further, glancing left and right. Nothing, except for a faint trail of wet footprints leading from the doorway into his apartment. Mark's chest tightened. "What the hell?" he whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. He turned back inside, and froze. A man stood in the corner of his living room. The figure was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so, with a long black coat dripping water onto the floor. His face was deathly pale, like a wax figure, and his lips were curved into a sharp, humorless smile. Mark stumbled backward, nearly tripping over himself. Who are you? How did you get in here?" The man tilted his head slightly, his smile never faltering. When he spoke, his voice was low and icy, sending shivers down Mark's spine. "You let me in." "No, I didn't." Mark stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Get out." He lunged for the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the wood and metal had fused together. He pounded on it with his fists, desperation creeping into his voice. "Help. Someone." "Don't bother," the man said calmly. Mark turned, his back against the door, watching in horror as the figure took a slow step forward. The light in the room seemed to dim with every movement. His coat left a slick, wet trail across the floor, as though he had just emerged from a lake. "You opened the door on Christmas night," the man continued, his grin widening unnaturally. "And so I came." Mark's hands trembled. Who are you? What do you want?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Mark's breath now came in visible puffs, the cold wrapping around him like invisible hands. "Get away from me!" Mark screamed, grabbing an empty beer bottle from the table and hurling it at the figure. The bottle shattered on impact, but the man didn't flinch. He merely smiled wider, his pale face stretching like a mask. Mark's knees buckled as the icy air seemed to sap his strength. His vision blurred, and he struggled to keep his focus on the figure. The man loomed over him now, his shadow swallowing the room. "You're mine now," the man whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally in Mark's ears. "No," Mark choked, his words cut off as the darkness around the figure seemed to expand, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating blanket. The world tilted, and Mark fell to the floor, his body frozen and his eyes widened. On the far wall, scrawled in dripping, black letters, was a single word. "Thanks." The landlord stumbled backward, nearly tripping over himself as he bolted for the door. In the hallway, he stopped to catch his breath, his mind racing. He would later tell the police that he felt something watching him, though there was no one there. And as he left the building, the faint echo of a voice whispered through the halls, soft, cold, and amused. "Merry Christmas." Responsive. His final scream echoed through the apartment before fading into silence. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, the building's landlord knocked on Mark's door, irritated by complaints from the neighbors. Probably drunk and making a scene again, he grumbled, unlocking the door. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet. Mark was gone, and the air hung heavy with an unnatural chill. The landlord frowned, shivering as he stepped inside. Water pooled on the floor, forming slick, dark trails that led toward the corner of the living room.